Welcome everyone to the National Equity Project's Implicit Bias, Structural Racialization, and Equity webinar. I'm Kathleen Osta, and I'm the Regional Director in our Midwest office.
Good morning, and I am Hugh Vasquez, Senior Associate in the Oakland office of the National Equity Project. We'll use the term implicit and unconscious bias interchangeably in this webinar. As we've been studying implicit bias, we have learned that our unconscious mind does not pay attention to data. Meaning and facts and statistics do not actually make much of a difference for our unconscious mind. If we want to get our unconscious mind's attention, we have to use story and metaphor. So in today's webinar, we will be using images, videos, stories, and interactive activities to spark our learning. So at this moment, I'm going to turn off the video, and you will see for the rest of the webinar, the PowerPoint slides.
So just a few words about the National Equity Project and who we are. The National Equity Project is a multiracial organization that supports leaders like all of you in education, philanthropy, government, and healthcare to learn about and tackle equity issues of importance to them and their communities. For us, leadership means taking responsibility for what matters to you. And part of this means building the skill and courage needed to raise and talk about inequities. Also important to us is that as leaders for equity, we're leading from a vision of creating organizations, schools, and communities in which everyone experiences a sense of belonging. With that in mind, we offer this metaphor that you can hold throughout this webinar that reminds us that being a leader for equity asks us to increase our self and our social awareness, particularly with regard to how systemic oppression plays out in our lives and in our communities. The mirror reminds us to consider how my own identity and life experience impacts how I see the world, and the window reminds me to think critically about how systems are at play and how others who are different from me may be experiencing the world. During the webinar today, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how our brain works. We'll talk about 3 processes that contribute to the creation of implicit bias. We'll spend a good period of time talking about this connection between structural racism and implicit bias, share with you some strategies that we have found helpful in mitigating and interrupting implicit bias. One note that we want to make is that implicit bias can play out with regard to any category of people. During today's webinar, we're going to focus specifically on race and racial groups. So we're going to begin with a story from Hugh.
So we all have stories about how implicit or unconscious bias lives within us, but we can't do anything about this bias until we make it visible. So I'm going to tell you a story from one of my experiences in my life about this. Years ago, I was working with high school youth on what we called back then unlearning oppression and building multicultural alliances. In order to do this work with the young people, I had to go through a lot of intensive training to examine my own biases, my own stereotypes, to understand oppression, to understand how all of that worked so I could work with the young people. On one hot summer day in Oakland, I was driving to lunch. I came to a stop signal, a stoplight, and in front of me was a crosswalk. Up on the side was a school, a middle school, I believe, and kids were walking across the crosswalk. My windows were down because it was a very warm day. And as I looked up, I saw 3 African-American boys crossing the crosswalk. As I came closer to my car, one of them looked at me and said this, "Go ahead, roll up your windows." Just like that. Now, my immediate reaction was upset, was more like, well, what the heck? How dare you say that to me? Do you know what I do for a living? I was upset. And as they walked by, I stared at them, not in necessarily a nice way, and they were staring back at me, by the way. Once they crossed, however, I began to calm down. My body began to relax, and I noticed that my finger was on the switch to roll up the window. I had no idea my hand had moved from the steering wheel to the window switch.
So what was happening for Hugh? In his conscious mind, He's an advocate. He's a leader for racial justice, an ally. He believes in fairness and has been working toward social justice for his whole career. However, his unconscious mind, which you see represented here in the iceberg, the larger part, registered fear when he saw those young African-American boys. He wasn't conscious of this, but his unconscious mind sent his hand to the window to roll it up. How could that be? How could that happen? We have a lot going on that we are not aware of in our brain. Our brain is processing 11 million pieces of information a second, and only 40 to 50 of those are conscious. It's hard to believe, but it's true. What does this mean? It means we're walking around largely unconscious. Have you ever driven all the way home from work, but not had a memory of doing so when you arrived at your home? That's because you have driven so many times that your unconscious mind knows the route, knows where to put the keys, knows how to turn the steering wheel. So it's all stored there through repetition. Our brain is hardwired to scan for any signs of danger, physical or emotional, and it's hardwired that way to ensure our survival.
So another point about, a couple of points about our brain. We know that people are meaning-making machines, that individually and collectively, the unconscious mind is helping us to make meaning of all those 11 million bits of information that we're processing every second. Our unconscious mind takes in all of this data, sorts it, makes meaning of it, and it's traveling, we say, at the speed of light. It's very, very fast. While our conscious mind is slow. It's like taking a slow walk. But it's our unconscious mind that helps us to survive. If you have ever felt fight, flight, or freeze in your life, and all of us have, you have had your unconscious mind working at that moment. And it's something that we want to keep as it helps us to survive. In the olden days, or even today, if I were walking down a pathway and I hear a rustling in the bushes, and if I were to rely on my conscious mind, it would sound something like this. Oh, I hear something going on in the bushes. I hear a little rattle. I hear some noise out there. I wonder what that is. Oh, I've heard that before, and bam, I'm gone, right? So the unconscious mind is not what we want to rely on in those moments. The conscious mind. The unconscious mind, however, says fight it, flee, get out of there, or freeze, determining what we need to do to survive. So we want to keep in mind that our unconscious mind is an important piece of us to have. We just want to know what's going on around us. Now, we want to take another look at how our brains are working. So we're going to ask you to participate in an activity right now. This is a little experiment where all you have to do is state the color of the text. I will be flashing text on the screen and would like you to state the color of the text, and do this aloud, even if you are by yourself. Do this aloud, and let's see what happens. All right, here we go. State the color of the text.
Blue, red, green, black, green, red, blue, oh, black, red, blue, green, red, black, blue.
All right, let's stop there. Take a breath, because you're probably tired already. And well, let's see what happened here. We want to ask you to think about what happened. So what happened, and what did you notice? So when the color of the text matched the name of the color, what we saw in these chats is that you were able to quickly say the word, right? But when the word was different in the color, from the color, then we hesitated, or we got it even wrong sometimes. There was a delay. Why is that? Because our brains have been conditioned to be able to quickly match the color with the word when they were the same. We've done that task over and over again, consciously and unconsciously, and in doing so, we have wired our brains to be able to do it automatically without thinking, which is a good thing, remember. We want our unconscious to be able to do that. But when we haven't done something over and over, we find that there's a gap. Our brain can't decide what to do. We go to our conscious mind and we begin to slow down. So let's do this again. Do this experiment again, and let's see what happens this time. Ready? Here we go. State the color of the text.
Blue, red, green, black, green, red, blue, black, green, red, blue,
All
black.
right. All right. Take a breath there. What happened that time? What we actually noticed that happens for people when we do this all over the place is that you get better at it. That already, that in one experiment, one trial, you probably were able to say the color and the word even when it didn't match. You were able to do that a little bit better as we did it the second time around. That's good news. Our brain already adapted. Our brains adapt quickly. We are able to change what goes on in our brains. That's the good news about this. So we want to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of our program, to remember that our brains can adapt. What is happening around us is that with our brains is that we are building pathways to be able to do things automatically. This is an image of a synapse. This is not a reproductive webinar. This is a series on unconscious bias, and this is a picture of a synapse. And when the synapse fires, which is that bright spot in the middle of this image, you see what gets produced are what looks like tentacles. Those are actually wires that allow us to do something very, very quickly, automatically, without thinking. And that's what happens when you saw the color and the word. When it matched, you could automatically do it. And the second time around, you were firing new synapses that were allowing you to produce some new wiring. And that's what we want to do with our work on unconscious bias, is that we want our synapses to fire more so that we are able to do things differently.
So now let's take a look at a definition of implicit bias. Implicit bias is the process of associating stereotypes or attitudes toward categories of people without conscious awareness. So keep in mind, our focus on implicit bias does not suggest that we don't still have explicit and conscious racism, because we do. But this is talking about people who consciously and genuinely believe in fairness, in equity, and equality. And like Hugh in his story, despite stated and felt beliefs, we still have biases that can lead us to react in ways that are at odds with our values. Really important here to note that it is not either or. We have both explicit bias and implicit bias that we are dealing with. But it's really important that we acknowledge that all of us, even the most fair-minded among us who've spent our life's work working toward social and racial justice, carry implicit bias. So now we want to take a look at the three processes that contribute to the creation of implicit bias: priming, associations, and assumptions. We're going to start by taking a look at priming. And I'm going to ask you to take a look at a video. If you've seen it before, just go with us, and there'll be a prompt at the end that we'll chat. Here we go.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
All right, if this was your first time seeing the video, did you see the moonwalking bear? So what happened here is we were primed to do something. We were primed to see the number of passes. We were not primed to look for a dancing bear. So while this activity is fun, and I have to say when we've done this with groups, we've actually had people ask us to replay it because they literally couldn't believe the dancing bear occurred in the first round. Our minds are tuned in to what we're primed to look for. So why is this important as leaders for equity and as leaders who are working for racial equity? It's important because we're primed, whether we're conscious of it or not, all the time. And so a key question for us to consider is, how have we been primed to think about different groups of people? The United States has a long history of systemic racism. Since the founding of our country, stories that dehumanized African Americans and Native peoples were used to justify genocide, slavery, racial segregation, mass incarceration, and police brutality. Negative and dehumanizing stereotypes about women and people of color, stories that other, are rampant in the news media and in popular culture. So we want to start to really pay attention to the ways in which we are primed and the messages that we're taking in, whether we're conscious of it or not. So let's take a look. What are the messages here about Latinas, about Latino people? What associations come to mind? Are we more likely to see photos of African American men in the media that look like this or like this? And what associations do the first set of photos create? What harmful stereotypes do they reinforce? Take a pause, take a moment, acknowledge any emotion that's coming up for you as you consider these ideas, and just think about, how have you been primed? Maybe even how have you been primed as early as this morning or sometime today by something you heard in the news media or saw out in the world. So priming is a really important part of our work with implicit bias, and a really important thing to consider as leaders for equity, both because we need to pay attention to how we are and have been primed, as well as we have to pay attention to how are we priming others, and what are the images and messages that we send consciously or unconsciously about groups of people.
So let's look now at the key process of associations. And this is about messaging, whether conscious or not, produces associations in our brains. I want you to take a look at these images and think about the associations that come to your mind. What's the association you have with Martha Stewart? What are your associations with this image of LL Cool J? And answer this question. It's not LL Cool J who's a convicted felon. It's Martha Stewart. Most of us know this, but the associations that are made with Martha Stewart versus LL Cool J are not the associations that are backed up by reality. There was a study that was done that brings the priming and associations into science. We actually have science that is telling us something about what's going on here. In this study, sensors were put on participants' heads that measured the activity in the part of the brain that lights up when you're having an empathy response. Participants were asked to watch two videos. One video was of a needle going into the hand of a white person. The second video was a needle going into the hand of a dark-skinned person. When participants saw the needle going into the white hand, the part of the brain that registers empathy lit up. But when they watched the video of the needle going into the dark-skinned hand, the part of the brain registering empathy did not light up. Why is that? Because we make associations about others produced by priming, and then we follow those assumptions or those associations with meaning about who those people are. So we want to take this to, this study has been repeated many times, and here's one of the other aspects of it.
So the study was repeated, and repeated with a purple hand. And when it was repeated, it was found that both African American and white participants registered empathy for the purple hand. And this is really important because what it suggests is that as humans, we're wired to feel the pain of others. We're wired to feel empathy for fellow humans. And the lack of empathy that the volunteers showed for people of other races was learned and not innate. So this is critical because it tells us that our socialization has reduced our empathy, but that's actually not how we're wired as humans. We're wired for empathy and connection. What's also hopeful about that is we can take steps and take actions to promote positive associations and increase empathy across racial groups.
So one other example we want to share with you about the associations. This is a newspaper article that came out when the Hurricane Katrina hit many years ago. The top portion shows a picture of an African-American man. The bottom picture shows a picture of a white man and a white woman. All of them are in the water. Here's what the headlines said to these images in the newspapers. The top one was this: a young, and we added the word black for emphasis, so we know what we're talking about. A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. The caption on the bottom, connected to the pictures of the white people, were two white residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through. So what we see here are associations that are being made in the media, in the newspaper. One association shows African Americans as looting and white people as finding. So we have to pay attention that these associations are happening to us all the time. It's the synapses that are firing, again showing an image of a synapse, that has us connecting bias with the priming, and this bias kicks in before we're even aware of it. It lives in the unconscious. It occurs through all these synapses firing over and over and again, and it results in autopilot, meaning we keep thinking that, in this case, to be a concrete example, the autopilot is black people are looting or white people are finding.
And likewise, in that example, we have to pay attention to the words we take in the media, because as someone reading that news story, I may not think, oh, why are they calling that looting and not gathering or finding? But this is the level of vigilance we need to bring to how we engage with media and popular culture, and bring that kind of critical lens to the ways in which we're being primed and increase our awareness of how we're being primed. So now we want to turn our attention to this notion of assumptions. As we talked about, we've all been primed through the media, our families, popular culture, and in literature. And we've been primed to think about to scan our environment, to think about who belongs and is safe, and who is, quote, other, and a potential threat or dangerous. This unconscious scanning impacts our reactions and our decisions. That our brain is scanning for signs of danger is innate and protects us, as in the example of an animal rustling in the bushes. Likewise, we need that innate reaction time. Say if we were to touch a hot stove, before we have the conscious thought of, oh, my hand is on the hot stove, we get a message to our hand to pull it away before we get burned. That protection is innate, but what and who we come to categorize as threatening is learned through priming and associations. So let's take a look at how that plays out with assumptions. We see it playing out as Rashawn Nelson and Dante Robinson had the police called on them by a white employee of Starbucks because it was assumed that they, quote, did not belong. We see it playing out with these two brothers, Kanawakran Thomas Gray and Shanawati Lloyd Gray, who were two Native American brothers on a college visit at Colorado State, and a white woman called the police because she felt that they did not belong on the college tour. We see this playing out with Lolade Simbola, who was taking a break from writing an essay in a student lounge at Yale when she had the police called on her. Just last week, this young man, Luca, was brutalized by police after he reached for a cell phone of a cell phone that came out of someone else's pocket during an interaction and altercation with the police. And when the police officer was asked about it, he said that the boy was acting, quote, aggressive. 15-year-old boy. It happens in the case of Tamir Rice and so many other unarmed African-American boys and men who've actually lost their lives and been killed by police. And these assumptions play out at the individual level, but they also show up at the policy level and at the collective level. These stereotypes and stories about the other lead us to make policies that are inhumane and create extreme exclusion and oppression. In this case, the United States enforcing a policy of separating children from their parents at the border. So I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath and acknowledge any feelings that are coming up. One of the things at the National Equity Project that we always try to do is to honor both the cognition and the emotion of leading for equity. And when you're ready, I want you to take a moment to consider and recall a time when you were aware that bias influenced your reactions. What was happening? How did you feel? And what did you do? So we want to hold this and acknowledge the sadness, but also know that part of what this is as leaders for equity is to be able to hold this, hold each other up in it, and start to think about what can we do about it. So what we want to do now is make this connection that we've been making, which is that implicit bias does not come out of nowhere. Implicit bias is located in a history, and it's located within systems. It's not just something that plays out among individuals. Structural racialization is a word that we have borrowed from John Powell at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And it refers to the institutional practices and structural arrangements that lead to racial inequities. We see these in the case of education, health, housing, and even life expectancy in the United States. These two phenomena, structural racialization and implicit bias, work dynamically to hold inequities in place. As leaders for equity, it's our responsibility to look at how our own biases and biases within our organizational policies and practices are contributing to the inequities, and to identify ways in which the structural inequities actually serve to reinforce harmful stereotypes and feed the unconscious bias that we carry. So how did we get here?
So we want to pay attention that dehumanizing practices and these narratives of unjust policies and explicit bias have been a thing that has happened in not just our present, but in our history. But let's take a look at history before we get to our present. There was a time when the structure that was around us, coming from explicit bias and implicit bias, had a structure where Black people were not allowed to actually sit or eat at lunch counters. We have examples. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Just to acknowledge that the United States at our founding, as we mentioned earlier, our roots are in racism and white supremacy. And so these policies and these practices, we can draw all the way back to the inception of our country.
Right. Another example is what was called redlining, right? And you see areas of red on these two maps. In those areas where most of the people of color and even poor people were living in these cities, the banks were not giving loans for home ownership in these areas. This was a structural arrangement that came from explicit and implicit biases. Another example. We had times in our past where miscegenation laws, anti-miscegenation laws were in place that actually made it illegal for people of color and white people to get together and marry, right? This was a structural arrangement, again, coming from explicit and implicit biases, part of our legacy in this country. We have another example where Native American children were taken from their homes, kidnapped from their homes, and put in boarding schools, a structural arrangement that again comes from these biases that we've been talking about. So these are a few historical examples, but we also have some current day practices and policies and structures that we want to unpack.
So we know that this history of systemic oppression in our country has led to extreme inequities that we still see present today in our communities. So we still have communities that look like the one at the top and like the one at the bottom. Because this has gone on for the whole course of history, to some extent, we have normalized what is actually not natural. We've come to accept at some level and go on, and as we drive through various neighborhoods, these stark differences, and rarely do we interrogate in professional settings and in our leadership, how did we get here? And why is this still being perpetuated through our policies? One of the pieces of work that we try to do is to help raise awareness of the historic and current policies and practices that keep these inequities in place. So for example, with structural racism, including racial segregation, underfunded schools, limited access to healthcare and healthy foods, we see poor outcomes for students of color and students living in poverty. Those poor outcomes, when viewed without a systemic or structural lens, can actually serve to reinforce an association between students of color and underachievement. Likewise, we have 400 years of policies and practices that have limited the opportunities of people of color. This has led to inequitable outcomes, which then reinforce harmful stereotypes and negative narratives. And these are then used to justify mistreatment, such as academic segregation, police brutality, mass incarceration, and less caring behavior. Our work as Leaders for Equity is to advance practices, policies, and narratives that expand our circle of human concern, that acknowledge these hard truths about our history, and that help us to work to create spaces where all people are cared for and experience belonging. As we've mentioned, these biases, we all hold them in our unconscious and have been primed to hold them, but they don't just play out at the individual level. These biases have always existed at the policy and systems level, and they continue to. Even among people who firmly believe they are fair-minded and equity-focused, find that we have biases that play out in decisions like who we call back for a job. There have been studies about resumes based on the sound of a person's name, and African-American sounding names get called back much less frequently than white sounding names, even within companies with a stated commitment to, quote, diversity. We see it playing out in terms of which students get placed in honors and AP classes and which get sent out of the classroom for discipline issues. We even see it in terms of who gets proper pain medication when they're interacting with doctors and hospitals. And as we've mentioned, it plays out in terms of how quickly some people are shot by police. So these are life and death issues. Implicit bias is, and the way that structures and bias interact are critical for us to take up as Leaders for Equity in order to quite literally save lives and also create communities in which we can all belong and thrive. So just want to take a minute and ask for us to pause and think about what kinds of decisions are being made in my school, organization, or system where bias may be playing out. And I'm just going to encourage you to push yourself to think about, even in places where you, again, believe your community or your staff or the people you work with are fair-minded and want the best, where might bias be playing out, even if we're not aware?
We are moving into the part where we're going to be looking at some promising news, actually, with how we have seen that our brains can change. And then we're going to be focusing in on ideas for one particular strategy, which is about changing the structure, because we were talking about how implicit bias and structure interact. So there is some promising news, and the promising news has something to do with our brains are able to change. It's called plasticity. Our brains are able to reconfigure based on the new synapses that are firing, new experiences, new learning, new stories, new interactions. Our brains are not fixed in place, which is all the good news. We remember that cells that fire together wire together, which means that our brains can change and can adapt. This restates some of this, that we can influence our unconscious, we can build new synapses, we can make new mental associations, we can make the invisible visible by bringing our conscious mind into play. So there are 4 strategies that we feel are prominent in doing this work. We're going to be looking at strategy number 4, but we want you to see the first 3 strategies. At another time, we may dig into these. Strategy number 1 is about recognizing what's going on in your lizard brain, which is the brain that gets triggered when something goes on around you that is triggering fight, flight, or freeze. And the strategy here is to recognize what's going on in your brain and prime it with an intention that replaces that stereotype that triggered it in the first place. Strategy number 2 is creating human connections across race and across difference. This is increasing opportunities for contact. The more we have opportunities for contact with people who are from different backgrounds, the more humanizing they become. So this creation of human connections is a very powerful strategy that we've seen make a big difference. Strategy number 3 is about creating new narratives, and it's about amplifying counter-stereotypic messages and images of people around us. So you look at just these few images on the screen, and if we were to look at creating new narratives about what we're seeing, we'd be talking about what we're seeing here are things like we're seeing scholars, we're seeing educators, we're seeing future leaders, and so on. But it's creating the new narratives. And strategy number 4 is about changing the structure that we're going to get into right now. So we want to give you some examples of how structures have changed. The first example we want to highlight is an example that comes from gender bias in auditions with orchestras. Some time ago, I believe it began with Philadelphia Orchestra, had an all-male orchestra, and someone started asking the question, why aren't women part of the orchestra? The answer was, we cannot find any qualified musicians to be accepted into the orchestra. So they decided to do auditions in a different way. They put up a curtain and auditioned from there. They found that by putting up the curtain, they couldn't see the participants, those who were auditioning. However, after a few trials of this, the makeup of the orchestra did not change. It still was all male, until they asked the question, well, what's going on in our auditions? And they realized that they were auditioning on a stage with a wooden floor, and they were able to hear those who were auditioning walk across the floor. And guess what they heard when the women walked across the floor? It had to do with their shoes. So their unconscious was able to determine they were listening to a woman, and nothing changed in the acceptance of the musician. So they put a carpet down on the floor, and they had people walk across that carpet, and within one audition, after having that carpet down where they could not hear the shoes, the orchestra increased by 50% women. They changed the structure.
So another place we know that implicit bias plays out is in healthcare. And studies have shown that medical professionals still believe in biological differences across race. Even though we know that race is a socially constructed thing, we've been so socialized to believe in these differences that doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals are carrying that inaccurate belief. What that has led to is that African American and Latino patients in particular are often their pain is often undermanaged. They're less likely to receive pain medication from doctors. So in some hospitals that recognize this disparity and this bias, they've put a structure in place where when the doctor goes to put in his or her notes, a message pops up that says, in this hospital, we have shown that we have under cared for the pain of our African American and Latino patients. Be sure you're not doing this. So it's acknowledging that this bias was playing out and putting a system in place to interrupt it. Another structural change that we know, quote, works is integrating our schools. Right now, our schools are more racially segregated than they were in the 70s. Following Brown v. Board, we pushed to integrate our schools, and the experiences of our students actually interacting with one another cross-race went up. That has been going down since the late 80s. So if you go to the next slide, we have the opportunity in most cases, either at the school, district, or classroom level, to make structural changes that would bring more children together across race and across socioeconomic background if we decided to do it and if we had the political will to do so. So you see in this image, where we draw the lines is our human decisions. And policies and laws that are in place have been made by humans. So we also have the opportunity to change these lines and get them to be more aligned with the values we hold. And if we know that relationships across various differences are what lead to more healthy communities and greater senses of belonging for more people, we have that within our power to do and to make happen in our systems.
So one more example, there is an experimental program that is looking very promising to interrupt implicit biases being playing out in prisons. There's a program where the structure of a particular floor was changed so that prisoners and guards or correctional officers interacted more freely, even to the extent that they put board games out on the floor and prisoners and correctional officers were playing board games together. What they have found is that this has resulted in assumptions and associations about the prisoners being changed by the guards, which has resulted in more humanizing behavior, which has reduced violence, has reduced the inmates being in trouble. And as these inmates have been released, it has reduced recidivism as well. So we're seeing that structural change, even in this instance, has a possibility of influencing implicit and unconscious bias so that the humanizing takes place and a different result is coming from that.
So here's a quote that we have found powerful and is a powerful reminder for us as leaders. Implicit biases come from the culture. I think of them as the thumbprint of the culture on our minds. Human beings have the ability to learn to associate two things together very quickly. That is innate. What we teach ourselves, what we choose to associate, is up to us. So the idea here is that as leaders for equity, we can work to identify and acknowledge the implicit biases we carry and create new positive associations at the individual, institutional, and structural level. And the more we do this, the more we create communities in which everyone experiences a sense of belonging.